Okay, excellent. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening for our webinar on Who Controls My Data. My name is Matilda Byrne. I'm co-president at Australian Peace and Security Forum. And like I said, thanks so much for being here for this really interesting discussion at, I think, a really critical point of time when we're thinking about data, privacy, all these kinds of considerations. I want to also acknowledge that I'm joining this evening from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd invite you to please share in the chat where you're joining from, the country that you're on, and I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging, and recognise that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and that sovereignty has never been ceded. I am also pleased to be introducing a guest moderator for our webinar this evening. So thank you very much to Dr. Nusha Shafiabadi, Professor of Computational Intelligence and Head of Discipline for IT at Australian Catholic University. Nusha is an internationally recognised expert in computational intelligence, artificial intelligence, and optimization, with more than 2 decades of experience bridging academia and industry. She is also the director of Women in AI for Social Good Lab. So I will hand over to you, Nusha, to take it away.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining, and thank you for having us here. Before we start, I would like to introduce our two speakers, Dr. Dennis Desmond and Dr. Bianca Baggiarini. So at first, I will introduce Dr. Dennis Desmond. He is the CTO of RAVINN Pty Ltd and Senior Industry Fellow at the University of Sunshine Coast, lecturing in cyber threat intelligence and cybercrime investigations. He holds a PhD in human factors and socio-technical systems, focused on cyber and financial technologies to disrupt crypto-laundering activities, a master in political science in Soviet political systems. And Dr. Desmond served as a counterintelligence special agent for the United States Army and Federal Bureau of Investigation, and as a senior intelligence officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency, specializing in identity operations. Thank you very much for being with us, and lovely to meet you here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Dr. Bianca Baggiarini is a lecturer in international relations at Deakin University. Her interdisciplinary research examines the social, political, and ethical justifications for militarized, remote, and autonomous systems. After completing a PhD at York University, Bianca undertook postdoc studies at Eunice W. Canberra at the Australian Defence Force Academy, with a focus on military AI ethics, and taught war studies at the Strategic and Defense Studies Center at ANU. So thank you very much, Bianca, for joining us. So if everybody is okay, we can start with our first presentation. Over to you, Dr. Desmond.
Just briefly, talking about a little bit about identity data, which is where most of my focus has been for the last few decades. The concept we were originally dealing with was identity defense, which was the protection of identity data from adversarial collection. What we discovered was the greatest collector of identity data was states, we call data aggregators. Pretty much anything that you did, any activity would involve an identity transaction. Was something. If you traveled somewhere, if you engaged with an online identity demand website, such as having to log in or having to any identity transaction in which you engaged was tracked and data was collected. That collection of data was then in turn aggregated, analyzed, resolved against single identities, and then packaged and then resold. Some of the most significant data aggregators that you might be aware of, including in Australia, include Infotrack, Dun & Bradstreet, LexisNexis, Thomson Reuters, and dozens of other sub-companies who deal in different identity data sets, such as Gartner Group, who is a marketing and advertising company that collects identity data. One of the concerns was how to manage online and aggregated identity data. This was like putting toothpaste back in a tube. Once identity transactions or digital breadcrumbs were released or leaked or offered up, it became almost impossible to remove that identity data. In the movies where you watch some spy has had his identity data removed from databases. Well, I was that guy. I was the guy who removed data sets and tried to manage the identity data for our clandestine collectors globally. And it got more and more difficult, not only to track down where the data was, but to figure out who had the data, who actually had possession of the data, and how that data was used. And it became almost just plain whack-a-mole after a while. Sure, you could remove it from government databases. It was pretty easy to remove it from certain locations, but the online presence and collection of data had grown so exponentially that not only did it aggregate in different locations, but it replicated across domains. So the idea that you could actually suppress or go off grid and remove data sets historically was a pretty innovative idea that you could actually do this. Unfortunately, nowadays, where literally at birth, all of your identity data is collected, shared, decentralized, cross-domain, aggregated, it's virtually impossible to remain off-grid or offline. And I just want to leave you with a scary thought to think about. We had looked at the possibility of creating digital clones. The idea was that you could be away from your presence, away from your home, away from your work, traveling abroad, engaged in operational activities. And if we had your behavioral data, if we had all of your emails, if we had all of your voice communications, if we had your social network analysis results, how you interacted with others, plus your utility data, plus your shopping data from all of your loyalty cards, plus your likes and dislikes online. If we had all that, and we basically could get it from a data aggregator, we could create a digital clone that could mimic you, which means that we wouldn't need you to be at any specific place at any specific time. We could use all of that data basically to pretend it was you when they engage someone on a global level. That also meant we could loan your identity out to somebody else, and they could use that identity data for whatever purposes they had. Here we are a couple of decades later with the advent of AI, commercialization of AI, and we now see that possibility realized in the commercial sector, where identity clones could be created within the corporate environment. We no longer need to have that employee because that employee now has been digitally replicated with the knowledge of the internet and can be trained and improved upon based on error recognition and then improvement. And we can now digitally clone humans. Kind of an interesting concept from a data perspective. And it makes you think about what data sets you're sharing, what data you're leaving, and with whom.
Oh, you want something?
And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. A very interesting presentation and lovely, to hear about these that people are talking about. Now I will pass on to Dr. Baggiarini to share her presentation with us.
All right. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thanks again to Russell for inviting me to join the webinar. It's a pleasure to be kind of talking to you all in this type of forum this evening. So it's been said recently that every war is now a drone war, and the recent Australian National Defence Strategy seems to confirm this. In the strategy, we see $425 billion in defense spending committed over the next 10 years, prioritizing things like undersea warfare, maritime capabilities, long-range strike, air and missile defense, as well as autonomous and uncrewed systems. And then, of course, the systems needed to counter autonomous and uncrewed systems when they're used against us. So what's referred to as counter uncrewed air systems. Some examples in Australia of these AI-powered and uncrewed technologies across domains include in the air domain, Boeing's Ghostbat is an uncrewed aircraft described as a pathfinder for the integration of autonomous systems and artificial intelligence to create smart human-machine teams. It has a range of more than 3,700 kilometers and has been designed to fly as a partner with or in collaboration with crewed Air Force platforms. So keeping with the kind of ghost theme at sea, we have the Ghost Shark. This is thought to be the most high-tech, long-range autonomous underwater capability that exists. And on land, we have kind of quite basic uncrewed land vehicles. So these vehicles have, well, in contact with the ground, they will not have any humans on board. And so their appeal is that they can be used where it's thought to be not practical or desirable to have a human present. So the logic underpinning all of these systems across domains is very similar. It is very much about preserving life on our side and reducing risk to personnel. So this ground vehicle, for example, will use sensors to observe the environment and will either autonomously make decisions or will pass the information to a human operator at a different location who will control, who can control the vehicle via a radio link, for instance. So the appeal of these systems is due to what's called their force multiplying effect. So you will see this phrase force multiplication across all domains in all the sort of ADF policy documents and discourse, meaning their ability to amplify combat power. So in a country like Australia, which has a very large land mass and a relatively small population and an even smaller defense force, there's a real perceived need to leverage technology to compensate for what Australia and indeed others lack, which is the ability to generate what's called mass through physical force. So in addition to force multiplication, AI is being used for things like targeting and decision support. So the idea here is that if we break conflict down, if we reduce conflict to just a series of decisions on top of decisions, the idea is that we could make faster and better decisions. And this gives us an advantage in the OODA loop, or what's called the observe, orient, decide, act loop. And this is a decision-making cycle that is common in military speak. So if we're able to shave off a few seconds, and these few seconds compound over long periods of time, the idea here is that we'll have battlefield advantage. In terms of targeting, you may have heard that the IDF, for example, recently deployed an artificial intelligence system called Habsora, which is Hebrew for the gospel, to select targets in Gaza. The system is used in short to find more targets for bombing. So similar to an algorithmic logic underpinning sort of, your Spotify, here are some suggested songs you might like. This is the same logic. Here are some suggested bombing targets you might like. So this system also was used to link locations to Hamas operatives and to estimate likely numbers of civilian deaths in advance. And so these targeting and decision support systems are non-deterministic systems, meaning that they're predictive. They're deployed to capture more data, but also to analyze these increasing quantities of data and then to make claims and judgments about the applicability of this data. So it's not just Australia ramping up its procurement and sovereign capability in the space of autonomy. Many are, for example, cutting back on foreign aid and then redistributing that money to what's a growing defense budgets worldwide. So Germany, for example, is undergoing a massive historic rearmament with the view to becoming the best conventional army in Europe by 2039. Likewise, driven by regional security threats, Japan is steadily moving away from its post-World War II pacifist position. So collectively, world investments in both drones and AI are going sort of nowhere but up. And so the question is, well, how did we get here? How can we explain this sort of new AI arms race or the proliferation of AI-enabled weapons? One explanation has to do with military strategy. So Christopher Coker was a professor of international relations at LSE for 4 decades, and he writes in his book, The Future of War, that war has transformed in kind of three critical phases or sort of worldviews over recent history. The first is a worldview focused first on force. So war as directed mechanized force. The second, so next is the idea of war as energy. And this is war as directed energy vis-a-vis the new study of thermodynamics that we saw associated with nuclear warfare in the sort of early to mid 20th century. To finally, war as information, where the dominant tool in society is now the computer. So when war is about information, according to the US Army after next annual report from, I believe, way back in 2002, when war is information, quote, knowledge is paramount. The unprecedented level of battle space awareness that is expected to be available will significantly reduce both fog and friction. Knowledge will shape the battle space and create conditions for success. It will permit distributed, decentralized, non-contiguous operations. It will provide security and reduce risk. So in the early days of the War on Terror, for example, drones were used primarily for ISR, for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance purposes. And although some were weaponized, and of course we saw targeted strikes, these drones were largely tools of information and data collection. So now we have, of course, more sophisticated lethal autonomous weapon systems, which can select and engage targets without human intervention. And the selection of, for example, who to kill is based not on a person's identity, sort of who they are, but rather on the signals that they, emit, so that the system picks up as threatening. So that's a lot that I just said, but I think the key thing is that data and information, and importantly, the speed at which we acquire data and information is now central to military strategy and how militaries view the prospects for success on the battlefield. So what do I mean by speed? So consider a former head of the IDF who has said that historically, traditionally, human intelligence analysts might produce 50 bombing targets in Gaza each year, but the Habsora system can produce 100 targets per day, along with real-time recommendations for which ones to attack. So this focus on military strategy being about information and speed, I think lends itself to another explanation as to how we got here, how we got to this point of AI-based sort of military build-up and expansion, which has to do more with like legal or ethical questions. It has to do more with a broader relationship between war and society. So we are witnessing, as you all know, several ongoing conflicts, and indeed the return to what some are claiming to be truly international war. At the same time, the post-World War II liberal international order is collapsing. So the norms and the architecture that have largely governed war are also collapsing at the same time that we see them increasing. So take, for example, just one particular example of in recent weeks from the war in Iran. I could select, dozens of examples. Investigations by Amnesty International found the US responsible for a deadly attack on a school packed full of children, killing 168 people, mostly children. And they found that the US violated international humanitarian law by failing to take all feasible precautions to avoid civilian harm. So now, under Trump, Hegseth, the Department of War, what have they done? They canceled the very program, the Civilian Protection Center of Excellence, that would have perhaps helped prevent this particular massacre of children. So they've accelerated AI adoption, removing barriers to leadership in AI dominance, they've now forbid individual states from regulating AI. And Pete Hegseth, in his quest against, quote, stupid rules of engagement, has established an AI acceleration policy that seeks to remove basically any kind of red tape. And Phil Clay, who you may know, an American veteran, has recently written in the New York Times that this administration, quote, delights in displays of violence and domination. They claim that it is, quote, more fun to sink ships than to capture them. So the degree of dehumanization is so blatant and so profound. And this dehumanization is shared. Sorry, I've got a sensor in my office, so the light goes off. Here we go. Sorry. This dehumanization, let's be clear, is shared by the likes of Palantir and other companies who support this expanded role of AI in government, military, and security practices. So Palantir, as you may know, develops data integration and analytics platforms. Of their software, Palantir claims, quote, it powers real-time AI-driven decisions in critical government and commercial enterprises in the West, from the factory floors to the front lines. Now, we know a lot about Palantir's involvement with the military, primarily the US military. In May 2025, the Pentagon increased a Palantir Maven contract ceiling to US 1.3 billion. So these are long-term partnerships providing AI-enabled tools and data platforms, which are now often cited as the kind of cornerstone of military modernization. But although there's a clear striving for technical modernization, with Palantir, ironically, what you get is something decidedly pre-modern. Okay, so there's this tension here between technical modernization with a political vision that is deeply pre-modern. So here's what I mean. So consider the recent publication of their manifesto, Palantir's manifesto, which is openly being called techno-fascist. So it includes many points, but they all kind of fall under the banner of techno-militarism and a wider critique of the international rules-based order. So this is a private company with a deeply political vision. Professor of philosophy Mark Koeckelberg recently summarized this issue sort of better than I could. So forgive me, I'm going to quote him a bit at length, but then I promise I'm sort of nearing the end of my talk. So of this manifesto, he says it is, quote, openly hostile to liberal democracy, rejects pluralism, inclusion, and empathy, and instead embraces hard power, read violence, and permanent warfare, ideal if you're an arms dealer. Talks about sacrifices for the nation and about drafting people into military service, cracks down on crime, welcomes religion in the realm of power, doesn't believe in the equality of cultures, but promotes Western supremacy and elitism, does not deem interiority and reflection necessary when it comes to the masses, that's reserved for the elite, promotes collaboration between big tech and the state, is positive about the suppression of dissent by means of surveillance systems that always know how to find you, talks about the rearmament of Germany and Japan, and argues for technological dominance over the enemies of the state. Not the usual language of tech, not even big tech, he goes on. If this sounds familiar, it should. The glorification of strength, warfare, and the nation, the subordination of the citizen to the state, and the entanglement of corporate and state power definitely rings a bell, more precisely, a fascist one. And so I'll end my talk by saying that while I often think that it's easier or sort of more tempting to focus on technology as a kind of site and source of our critique, really, I think that technology is often a kind of a symptom of a wider societal problems. So I think that technology actually allows us to sort of hold a mirror up to society and actually tells us something else going on sort of more deeply in society. So in this case, I think that AI and drones sort of besides, illustrating the changing character of strategy and the changing character and quality of war, oftentimes, what they more importantly signal is, in my view, a reallocation or a concentration of power away from regular people and away from the conditions that sort of make up what we think is required for like a good representative democracy, let's say. So ultimately, the question is sort of in whose name is war being waged? And to ensure that war is being waged sort of in our name, society, so us, hypothetically, need to become, I think, reinvested in challenging unchecked militarism, which is something that I know obviously this group is, keen to do. And on more on the home front, I mean, Palantir's work, contract with Coles, for example, is similarly about surveillance and control. But because this is a civilian domain, it's perhaps more banal and thus has a way of kind of sneaking into the background of sort of daily life in ways that, might not get as much attention as a battle space, for example. But essentially, I want to leave you with the idea that the military and the civilian realms are actually like deeply interconnected, and that the technology actually tells us, is showing us how deeply interconnected these realms are. Anyways, I'll stop now. Happy to talk more about this. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bianca. Great presentation. So I will open the floor for questions from our audience and the participants. And if there aren't any questions in the chat, then I will ask some questions from Dennis and Bianca myself. So any questions you would like to ask? No? Okay. So I will start with a question for Dennis. Dennis, you mentioned very scary things that are happening with identity clone and information theft. How can we protect ourselves as the users of technology? And sometimes we have no choice rather than use something. Even, for example, you want to submit your tax, you have to put in your information on the website. So, what are some practical ways for us to protect ourselves?
So, this is a very difficult approach in the current environment that we live in, mostly because to deny data sharing is to accept that you may not receive the quid pro quo of benefits, whether it's from the government, whether it's from the commercial sector. We exchange data for services and products. If you have a loyalty card, you're paid in discounts so they can collect shopping history. You agree to facial detection and facial recognition when you go into Bunnings or any of the big box stores in exchange for being allowed to shop on their premises. Anything that you do generates transactional data, and therefore that data is collected. There are certain things that you can try which are more difficult to reduce your what's called digital signature or signature reduction when you go out and interact with your environment. It's possible to go off grid. It's possible to run off generators. You can purchase items with cash. You can use infrared and thermal defeating hats and glasses, masks, makeup, clothing. You can go through the process of putting a credit ban or freeze if you're in the United States. You can actually create a credit ban which prevents the credit information from being resold or shared. You can opt out through data aggregators, going through an opt-out page. Many of the major data aggregators provide the opportunity for an opt-out. You can go through identity suppression subscription services. You pay a monthly charge. They hunt the internet and look for your data in people finders. They look for information about you, and they issue takedown notices or suppression notices. You can coordinate with a lot of different agencies. I recommend people set up Google alerts with your name in various forms. So Dennis Desmond in quotes, Dennis B. Desmond in quotes, Dennis.D, and then set up just a dedicated Google account just for that purpose. And anytime your name shows up anywhere online, you get an alert, and then you can go and issue a takedown notice. You can also do things like use VPNs anytime you connect. Read the terms of service and the end user license agreements, whether or not you have to share private or personal data with those agencies who are providing you a service or product. You don't have to be honest if you have social media profiles. I would say if you are interested in not sharing, don't have social media profiles, but obviously we want to maintain connections with family. Guess what? You don't have to use your real name, and you can lock down your profile, and you can put spurious information in your profile. Incorrect date of birth, don't use your face, use an avatar instead. Things like that. Try not to make public postings on any of the social media platforms. I do what's called identity segmentation. I have probably 20 or so email accounts that I use for different things. I have a throwaway account that I can give someone if they absolutely have to have it, and then I delete it at the end of the year and I get a new one. I habitually lose my credit card and ATM cards annually and get new ones from the bank. That not only helps with spurious subscriptions where I didn't opt in for a subscription, but also it's more secure in the case of identity theft or fraud. By changing out your bank cards periodically, it helps. When you go to the store, if you don't want to carry cash, carry a stored value card, SVC, or a cash card. Go buy a Visa vanilla card or a MasterCard vanilla card or a Post card and use that to pay for large ticket items instead of paying cash or paying with a credit card. They have the same appearance as a credit card, so you can even use them online instead of using PayPal or any of the other cash online cash sites. I mean, I can go on and on and on and on. There's a lot of it's a science in and of itself for identity management and identity defense, and these were things that we taught our officers when they traveled to help reduce their signature because of the data collection efforts. And you can even put on the tinfoil hat and keep your credit cards and your passports and driver's license in Faraday protected wallets so that RFID collection can't occur. You can get license plate covers that will defeat the cameras, and don't use tolls, get billed, and then pay with a cash card. I mean, there's a lot of little tricks that you can use to reduce your signature, but it's very, very, very labor intensive, very time intensive. And you have to think about everything you do all the time that generates what we call a digital breadcrumb or a digital identity leak that you're sharing with someone. But identify where your data is, know who has it, understand where it sits, who shares it, how it's bought and sold, and then take actions to have that data removed from those data aggregators or resellers.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. I have another question from you, Dennis, but we will see if we have time for it because there are some questions in the chat that I think they're addressed to Bianca. The first one is saying, can you provide some background on the partnership between Coles and Palantir? I hadn't heard of the arrangement until I saw the description in this session.
Yeah, so I think the Coles thing is relatively new. I think Crikey News has been reporting in the past couple of days on Palantir contracts with Australia in general. So Australia has $60 billion worth of contracts, various contracts with Palantir. and has for many years now. So the Coles thing, I'm not super familiar with it, but I do know a little bit, which is to say, from Coles' perspective, they're looking to save money. They want to save $1 billion or something like this. So how do they save money? Well, they need to look for problems and they need to come up with solutions around optimization. We have to optimize human labor and we have to, everything is about optimization. So what do? Palantir sends in its sort of workers, its engineers, its whoever to take all of the data that Kohl's has. Okay, what are the stores that are underperforming? Why are they underperforming? When are they underperforming? Who are the workers that are underperforming? Are there too many workers? What are the workers doing? How exactly are they spending their time? All of this data is unlikely to be kind of fragmented and like patchwork type data incomplete. Palantir comes in and tries to, complete the data picture essentially and provide ways in which Kohl's can ultimately save money. So this will look like probably laying off workers. It will look like, maybe closing certain locations. I don't know, this kind of stuff. But ultimately will be about, I think, increased surveillance of workers. There was a second question too, which do you mind if I just
No, sure.
do it? Okay, so it was, what is the um, biggest concern? Okay, well, there's so many, I don't have enough time, but here's one of them. So you have to keep in mind the first point is that AI and drones in particular are presented to us, liberal democratic societies as being ethically good, as being morally good. Why? Because they help protect Australian warfighters. Why wouldn't you want these technologies? They help us keep our short, we have so few Australian Defence Force personnel. Okay, we can't afford to lose them. We must keep the ones we have. We cannot put them at risk. So these technologies help us preserve life on our side. So in order to argue against that, you're already starting off in a kind of a weird position because it's basically, well, you're saying you don't want us to protect Australian soldiers. Well, that's very, un-Australian of you. That's a very difficult position to argue against. So the technology is packaged first and foremost as an ethical good. Okay. It is ethically desirable to deploy these technologies to save life. So that's your first problem. It becomes hard to critique. It becomes very difficult to critique that line of argumentation. But I think what the technology does is that it's ultimately blurring war and peace and blurring military and civilian domains, meaning that historically we've thought that war is exceptional, meaning that it is rare, it is limited, it is, only in self-defense. This is the idea we've come to accept for the past 80 some odd years. But what this technology allows us to do is to sort of expand the temporal reach, the temporal and spatial reach of war capability without the political investment that has historically been central to war making. In other words, you do not need to send Australian troops anywhere. You can deploy the technology and conduct the targeted military actions removed from Australian public and Australian society and Australian personnel. So what it does is it lowers the cost of entry into war because that political check has been overcome. So if I have to send troops this is why you're not going to see any troops going into the Strait of Hormuz, okay? American troops. Why? Because that escalates war dramatically, and the American public will not tolerate troops, mass casualties, etc. And any troops going to take over that island, Karg Island, they're very vulnerable. You're going to see mass casualties. That won't be tolerated. But we often tolerate war that doesn't involve us sending in our troops. This is an ethical problem because people are sort of like the way that we measure the ethics and politics of war. So if we can do war without people, it distances us from the ethical and political consequences and actually makes us more ethically compromised. So I will stop there because I could go on forever about that question. But that's just sort of my initial sort of take on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. There is another question in the chat for Dennis. Someone has said, I refuse to enter my date of birth as I consider it as a risk that it's one of the key identifiers. New legislation in Australia is suggesting we have to provide proof of age on social media. How do you get around this?
Good luck. Um, Biometric recognition has been accepted if you don't want to provide credentials. But what it comes down to, again, this is you have to give up privacy in order to gain access to a service. It's an exchange, and they expect that you will want to use the service, and therefore you either have to provide your credentials, verify an age, or use their biometric recognition age verification process. It becomes a real challenge. Meta has gotten very, very um, demanding over the last several years, demanding proof of identity, not only just phone numbers, but also credentials, driver's licenses, passports, things of that nature. And you will see a shift toward this, demanding more and more credentials. And it's not just about age verification, it's about identity verification. And that's when they harvest and collect that data. Although in their terms of service, they may say they delete the data as soon as the age has been verified. That's not always the case. They have found several organizations that have retained the data for years after they said they've supposedly deleted it. So it just comes down, bottom line for your answer is, if you want to use the service, depending on your age, you're basically going to have to give up your face or credentials in order to use that service. Unless you opt in for a service, and you can get around it through a VPN and enter into another location that doesn't demand age, which is possible as well, using a synthetic identity and a VPN to circumvent the controls.
Okay, thank you very much. Russell has a question, which if that's okay, I will leave it to the end. There is another question in the chat for Bianca. The question is, I have just recently read from the Nobel laureate 2004, David Gross. He essentially said that we have 35 years ahead of us as humanity will disappear due to the risks of a nuclear war. Given the association of nuclear arms race, again, as the end of Cold War gave us a respite, but here we are again. Artificial intelligence and the deterrence rationale we have increased in 2% for military confrontation. What is your opinion in those things?
Right. Thank you so much for the question. So it is the case, definitely in Australian strategic policy landscape, that deterrence and AI are often conflated. I mean, it's the core public justification for AUKUS is deterrence, and a huge part of AUKUS is Pillar 2, which is on technology. It doesn't get talked about as much as Pillar 1. It's not as interesting, but Pillar 2 is very much about this idea that there's this unquestioned association between AI and deterrence. I actually am part of a $500,000 grant that looks at and challenges the view that AI and deterrence are complementary. I actually don't think they are. And if anyone's in Canberra in June and wants to come to this huge workshop I'm hosting with international people working in deterrence, let me know and I'd be happy to include you. So this is a topic that I'm thinking about a lot right now. In some ways, the comparison between sort of AI deterrence and nuclear deterrence is a bit like weird and a bit false because nuclear weapons are so different from, like, let's say AI-enabled drones. Nuclear weapons require so much expertise, so much time, materials that are highly controlled. These are very centralized weapons. AI and drones are quite the opposite in the sense that, anybody can build them. Anybody can just whip them off the shelf and throw a weapon into the sky and, have it crash into somewhere. Essentially, the cost the expertise, the materials, the resources, the costs, et cetera, to build those kinds of weapons are so different from nuclear weapons. And so people that do nuclear deterrence basically think like, well, AI and drones cannot compete. They don't really have much to say about deterrence, because ultimately nuclear weapons are the real deterrence, and anything else is just kind of background noise. However, in my view, the risk of drones and AI destabilizing society at the strategic level. So the idea that we could have misinformation or escalation or miscommunication that is generated by AI, where AI is actually the source of this, causing nuclear conflict or nuclear exchange is perhaps quite likely. So there's a way in which these AI weapons and emerging technologies can like contribute to nuclear escalation in an indirect way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank
I'll
you.
stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. There is another question, and is saying, does the government have a role in protecting citizens against data imperialization?
How many of you have read Osio's amendment that comes before the Senate? Bill number 2. How many of you have read that? Read it. I, having worked obviously with three-letter agencies most of my career and been involved in Special Operations Command was my last assignment, it kind of surprises me the level of involvement that an intelligence agency would have domestically. The question is very prescient, but what we're seeing is the move towards a surveillance economy, much more than we have been exposed to historically. The use of flock cameras, the use of facial detection and facial recognition, object recognition cameras, tracking cell phones, IMSI, IMEI data sets, de-anonymization of data. And in order to get around the privacy constraints that governments have, they often will purchase it commercially. That prevents them from having to do the direct collection themselves. And in order to circumvent security controls, they're able to purchase this data and exploit it accordingly. As we move into, as we've seen some restrictions on free speech, and we've seen restrictions on public gatherings to include symbology. I think if you have a read of that document, you'll understand a little bit more of where the government intends to move, which is to make more permanent the ability to circumvent any previous controls and acquire data and acquire access and coerce individuals to comply with interviews and interrogations.
Okay, thank you. There is another question in the chat. It's saying, I have an important idea about decreased conflict with AI, and can I ask for calling? AI on autonomous weapons is a big concern. Penny Wong expressed concerns about this at the Security Council of the UN last year, especially if AI linked to control of nuclear weapons. Yet Australia is actively involved in developing AI-controlled autonomous military vehicles and weapons. In the future, we may have nuclear weapons on US subs and planes operating from Australia as part of AUKUS and Force Posture Agreement. There is a contradiction here between rhetoric and what Australia is doing as part of AUKUS. So this is...
Yeah, so I fully agree with you, Colin. I have been Australia to be at all the UN sort of meetings and conventions that have been ongoing for 15 years now. Australia aligns itself with the US in terms of not taking any measures to, stop the research and development of autonomous systems. So it was very much in the camp of development and progression in this space. And indeed, like the risk of AUKUS is, I think, quite considerable for Australians who might not really be aware of what is likely to happen if China invades Taiwan or incurs in a Taiwan Strait. The US feels the need to live up to its threats that and it retaliates. Well, Australia will have a very difficult time not being pulled into that kind of conflict. And Australia will have a very difficult time denying the US from using its northern territories for personnel, store, logistics, blah, blah, blah. So I think that in general, like Australians are not really awake. I'm making a general claim, but like I don't know how switched on most people are to this. That actually with AUKUS, we've really deeply embedded ourselves in a horrific current administration, which doesn't necessarily end with Trump. It could continue on with JD Vance or someone even smart, someone actually smart. Okay, so this is a real problem for questions of sovereignty. Like, what does AUKUS do about sovereignty? What does it mean for sovereignty? Us, the public rhetoric from defense, everyone is, oh, we will never relinquish our sovereign capability, our sovereignty, etc. I agree that I personally also been a bit sort of disgusted with the Penny Wong and others and the sort of reactions to Gaza, to conflicts, is sort of very weak, morally weak, problematic statements that, are so just wrong, and just so clearly aligned with US, I don't know, US bullying, I would say. It makes me very concerned for the future. And indeed, the nuclear doomsday clock is at the highest it's ever been. So I don't remember the figure, but the atomic bulletin of atomic scientists that have, they have a nuclear doomsday clock, which is what it sounds. It is what it sounds, and it's never been at this level before. So the world is concerned. And this is why we see build up militarization and defense postures and defense forces building up everywhere and have for the past 10 years continuously gone up because of this reaction to really everyone else, right? This is this security dilemma in international relations 101. When I arm myself, it makes my adversary or my neighbor also arm themselves. Like, so it's very basic stuff, but I think we're seeing it accelerate very quickly with these technologies. And the question about how to encourage, my children to understand this reality, I don't know, but if you find out, let me know because I also have young children and I'm also struggling all the time with how to explain these things to them.
So putting my military hat on, I was in the Army for 23 years, and my last duty assignment was at Special Operations Command. I would say that the world is very nervous. The U.S. has proven it can't fight an asymmetric warfare and a mosaic defense, that it's incapable of successfully accomplishing whatever its goals were in the Middle East. And China and Russia are paying very close attention to the U.S. strategy in the region and its failure and its inability to accomplish any reasonable goals. Canada understands exactly what's going on and is shifting its alliances away from the U.S. And I think Australia would be well served to do the same. I think reliance on the U.S. for any kind of defense, considering the distance, the inability of aircraft to refuel, so they couldn't conduct any offensive missions because of the distance, and the requirement for engaging long warfare is right now, they're spread so thin and they've already used up half of their munitions just fighting this relatively small country. which should give you an idea that the U.S. in its current form, it would be hard pressed to fight a two-front war, which means Europe and Asia. So I think this has been a wake-up call for a lot of the Commonwealth countries, the Five Eyes members, as well as the AUKUS members.
Yes, thank you. There is time for one more question, I think, yeah? They have asked, how can we find ways to chat more with each other about these things to increase the understanding and, effectively increase our community response?
Well, I think this is what we're doing right here. Like I think these types of forums are so important. These like local community spaces, what Russell and others, you all are organizing, it's really important. I'm old, people can email me if they want to chat, or I'm in Melbourne, but I go to Canberra often. Happy to participate in future conversations on these topics.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? No? Can I ask one more question? I have a question from Dennis. Dennis, you mentioned about identity clones and how they put us at risk of displacing jobs. So what type of jobs do you foresee that will be displaced faster rather than the others through these types of technologies?
So we used to say that low-skilled, blue-collar jobs were at greatest risk, and that a lot of the mechanical jobs would ultimately be replaced by robots, and therefore the more sophisticated, highly skilled jobs were less at risk. And what we're seeing more and more is even the
motion detected at fire break 1.
Sorry, I have detection cameras set up. So, as a result, what we're seeing is the potential to replace just about any job that you can imagine based on knowledge, skills, and abilities. If an AI tool can interface with a customer, can interface with another individual, we're seeing more and more of those skills being replaced. We're seeing Amazon en masse replacing workers in its warehouses with robots. China's been at the forefront of this. We're seeing autonomous vehicles. So imagine if you want to go grocery shopping, the new generation is no longer owning, it's looking to actually lease or rent or borrow vehicles. So taxi cab drivers, even Uber drivers, Lyft drivers probably are on their way out because of autonomous vehicle systems. You look at surgeons, pretty soon, basically, we would expect that a highly trained, qualified, experienced surgeon would not be in danger of having their livelihood taken over by AI or robot. And what we're seeing, again, is remote and autonomous systems able to perform very delicate operations. A lot of the sci-fi films that we've seen for decades and kind of laughed about and thought, oh, that'll never happen. More and more, we're starting to see the reality where the fantasy is becoming a real threat. I tell you, I think that the jobs that are going to be replacing, remember the old, the idea that
motion detected at driveway.
The idea that when the vehicle was invented, horse and buggy went away. When the electric light bulb was invented, we lost gas lamps. What we're seeing now is increasing requirements for AI prompt engineers. We're seeing AI developers, vibe coders, quality assurance people to look at code to verify AI coded, vibe coded, or codex coded programs and software are actually operational and capable. So we're seeing the folks moving into the support roles where AI is pretty much taking over every aspect. Even in my jobs in cybersecurity, cyber threat intelligence, firewalls being incorporated with behavioral analysis, identifying attempted intrusions, phishing emails, you name it. They're being integrated by Fortinet, by IBM, by Azure, and we're seeing across the board AI being integrated in just about every aspect of our lives. And of course, as Bianca said, in the defense area, when I was a Special Operations Command, the Special Mission Units, incorporating more and more autonomous systems, whether it's what we call dog bots to carry packs, whether it was sensors, ground sensors, acoustic sensors, thermal, infrared, airborne sensors, GSRs, all that, again, being replaced by AI because they were faster, better at object recognition and differentiation, and could report a lot more rapidly than a human in the field.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I think we are at 7 o'clock, so we might have to finish our today's meeting. And thank you, everyone. And I would like to thank both our speakers and everyone else who has joined this session. And over to you, Russell. Would you like to say anything?
But thank you very much to Desmond and to Bianca, who's gone into the dark again, and to you, Nusha, for moderating the session. It was a frightening session, but thank you very much for sharing your insights and knowledge about it. How we deal with this, somebody asked the question about why don't we have more discussion around this, and Bianca said we ought to have more discussion around this. I agree, but how do we avoid mass depression when you start to understand what's going on and you feel so powerless in the front of it? But thank you for a most interesting session tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much for the invitation.